loud. And welcome everyone. I'm going to mute everybody. Rabbi, please unmute. And I think we're good to go here.
Right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm sorry for the confusion about the movie this week. As someone mentioned last week, it just happened to be playing on Turner Classic Movies last week. So I actually had it on my DVR from Turner Classic Movies, and that's the version I rewatched in order to prepare for today. So I never actually followed the line through Amazon to see what they were showing, which of course, as most of you now know, that a version that was available at a reasonable price, 99 cents, was the Playhouse 90 version of this, which precedes the movie by 2 years. It was broadcast in 1959, and with a couple of the same stars, primarily Maximilian Schell playing the same role in both the live television version. So it was broadcast live originally, and then the film version from a couple of years later. The directors are different. The director of the television one was George Roy Hill, who became a well-known film director later on. He directed Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting, among other things, but got his start as a number of the directors that we've looked at in live television. So Stanley Kramer is the director of the movie, and we'll talk about him in a little more depth in a minute. So I intended for you to see the 3-hour-long movie version of this. So we can do some, as you were when I came online, do some comparing and contrasting. Those of you who have seen both, or even if you've only seen one, perhaps we can compare notes a little bit on the two different productions. The movie, which came out in 1961, actually had 10 Oscar nominations, and 11 if you include the fact that the director, Stanley Kramer, got an honorary Oscar that year. So he was not given the award, and I think wasn't even nominated for directing. No, he was nominated for directing as well, but he got an honorary award. Stanley Kramer, I mean, a very interesting guy who was sometimes referred to as the conscience of Hollywood, or the conscience of the American film industry. So he made, as both a producer and a director, movies that that made people confront their conscience a little bit. So he won the Irving Thalberg Award, which is a humanitarian award from the Oscars as well. I read somewhere someone called him the only truly responsible director in Hollywood. And some of the movies that you may have seen over the years, I mean, he directed The Defiant Ones a couple of years before this with Tony Curtis. On the Beach in 1959. The movie directed just before this one was Inherit the Wind, and then Judgment at Nuremberg in 1961. As a producer, he was involved in a number of other movies. He made a movie called The Men, which is mostly remembered as Marlon Brando's first movie role. And he made a movie, his first movie as a producer was called Champion. It actually starred Kirk Douglas, another boxing movie. And Home of the Brave was next. And that was from a story that was about anti-Semitism, but actually they changed that in the movie and made the movie about race issues instead. But he also produced Cyrano in the 1950s. He produced High Noon. He produced the screen version of Death of a Salesman. So yeah, you want to scroll back to see some of the things. So in the 60s, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner,
Yeah, right.
So you can see that he clearly had some serious ideas on his mind. And while he made some entertaining films, certainly, yeah, and I think I saw Vanessa's cursor go over The Juggler, which I've mentioned a couple of times, that maybe we'll put in our the next round of these if we do another round, starring Kirk Douglas as a Holocaust survivor, filmed in Israel in 1953, if I remember correctly. So it's interesting both to see some of the backgrounds of Israel in that time period. It's certainly an interesting story as well. So, so Stanley Kramer, who lived from 1913 to 2001, from a Jewish family, born in New York City. I think, his birth name, I think, was Stanley Abramson, and became Stanley Kramer. But he went to Hollywood in the 1930s. He came up, he started out on the swing gang in movies, which means the guys who kind of move the equipment around, right? And then eventually worked his way up to being an apprentice editor, which it's actually interesting in terms of his work as a director, that to understand editing is very valuable as a director, because the editor takes all the different takes that the director films and puts them together in a coherent way. But if the director understands editing, in a sense, Stanley Kramer used to say that he edited the movie as he shot it, right? So he gave the editor the shots that he wanted in the movie. So there wasn't a lot of reconstruction of what the director has filmed. So, which also means that he worked economically, which was important to him as he was producing his own movies, right? So you don't want to waste a lot of film footage and things like that. So, so he really came up from, moving scenery around to being an apprentice editor, writing scripts for radio programs. During World War II, he was making training films and things like that. And then after the war, that's when he really gets his start as a producer and a director, which continues, into the late 70s, I think, maybe even the 80s. He was still directing some things. He's not the most stylish director around, but he does some very evocative things now and then, and I think he picks his places. There's a scene in this movie, for example, and I doubt that there's anything equivalent in the Playhouse 90 version, where he's in a restaurant with Marlena Dietrich and the music's playing and people are pounding their beer steins on the table, and it cuts to the judge banging his gavel on the desk, right? And so that sound continuity makes for a very interesting and striking image. So he does that from time to time in the movies. Often he'll just kind of set up the camera and let it take in the scene. But every now and then he throws in these flourishes that are interesting. So he's not remembered as one of the great auteurs of filmmaking, but to be, I think he would certainly trade that for the title that he was given. So I told you, the conscience of the American film industry. Would you rather be that or somebody who had some extra style in their movies? So a very honorable guy, I think, from all accounts. So I mentioned the movie had 10 Oscar nominations. It lost in most of those categories to West Side Story. So with misfortune of coming out, in most years you'd say, well, a movie that got 10 nominations, that's close to the most ever, right? Well, but that year West Side Story had one more than they did, and so was nominated for Best Picture, which West Side Story won. Was nominated for Best Director, which Robert Wise won for West Side Story. It was nominated for Best Supporting Actor for Montgomery Clift for absolutely remarkable 12 minutes of screen time. But George Chakiris from West Side Story won that Oscar. It was nominated for Best Supporting Actress for Judy Garland, who is quite good in this movie and really sort of cast against type in many ways in this. But the winner of the Oscar was Rita Moreno for West Side Story. So you get the picture. It was nominated for art direction and cinematography, and costume design and editing. In all of those categories, art direction and cinematography, that was back in the days when there was separate awards for black and white cinematography and color. So the cinematography award went to The Hustler that year with Paul Newman. And art direction also went to The Hustler. Costume design went to a movie called La Dolce Vita, Federico Fellini movie. And the editing award went to West Side Story. So you can decide for yourself whether they were robbed. I mean, West Side Story is a good movie. It's hard to argue with some of those things. But Judy Garland and Montgomery Clift in particular, I mean, they're give heartbreaking performances that are in many ways the linchpin of the entire 3-hour movie. All right, they are very special in this. In terms of the awards that it actually won, I think they are very well deserved as well. Maximilian Schell won the Best Actor award, even though Spencer Tracy was also nominated for Best Actor for this movie that year. So, and as we've talked about before, conventional wisdom is when two people from the same movie get nominated, they split the vote. But Maximilian Schell won. And it is a very finely performed, very finely calibrated performance, I think. As I mentioned, he's one of the very few holdovers from the Playhouse 90 version to the movie version. The other award that it won was for Best Screenplay. The writer's name is Abby Mann. His given name when he was born was Abraham Goodman. Changed his name to Abby Mann. He wrote the television play for Judgment at Nuremberg, and then continued to add to it and created the screenplay for the movie version of Judgment at Nuremberg as well. So he was nominated for an Oscar for this, and a few years later he was nominated again for a movie also directed by Stanley Kramer, Ship of Fools, which also relates to the Holocaust a little more peripherally than this movie does. He won an Emmy for his script for the Simon Wiesenthal story, which was 25 years later, 1989. And he also won a couple of other Emmys for projects that don't relate to Jews, but they're interesting. I mean, he wrote the script for the TV movie called The Marcus Nelson Murders, which introduced a character named Theo Kojak with Telly Savalas. So that becomes, because that movie is so popular, the TV series Kojak was created, and Abby Mann was one of the creators of that show. In 1995, he was still working and wrote the screenplay for a movie that was based on the McMartin preschool trials, which also won an Emmy. So Abby Mann and Stanley Kramer were a formidable team. They did a fair amount of work together, including the ones that are award-winning that I've mentioned. Abby Mann was born in Philadelphia in 1927, died in 2008. And as I said, was still 1995, he got an Emmy. So he was continuing to write, well into his old age. Of course, the whole movie is filled with movie stars. And the television version is no slouch either. The part that Spencer Tracy plays in the movie, I believe, is Claude Rains in the TV version, right? So, so you're talking about.
It took me most of the movie. I'm like, I know him. Casablanca.
Right. Yeah. So, and Melvin Douglas as the prosecutor, right? I mean, there's no slouches in that as well. There is if this takes some paying attention, but we have noticed that they don't mention gas chambers in the television version. It's because one of the sponsors was a gas company, and which I think we saw. Wasn't that in the front? Those of you who were with us for the front, I think there's a joke about that. They have to rewrite a part of one of the television plays. The Woody Allen character has to get in touch with the writer. So it's based on this. This is where it actually happened. That this Holocaust drama couldn't mention the gas chambers because the sponsor thought it would be didn't want gas appliances to be associated with the Holocaust, right? So, that's a little bit of a trivia note for you. So the TV version has Martin Milner, who you may know from wasn't he in Route 66, as well as Adam 12, right? So a pretty star-studded cast in and of itself. The movie, of course, the names go on in the movie, right? Spencer Tracy, of course, Maximilian Schell, and then in the supporting roles, you'd say Bert Lancaster, Judy Garland, Richard Windmark, Montgomery Clift, Marlena Dietrich. I'm going too fast for Vanessa, to put up all these names, but that's okay. And of course, you probably noticed William Shatner in it, so 5 years before Star Trek. So I don't know if there's any pictures of him from Judgment at Nuremberg. There's certainly plenty of them as Captain Kirk, right? And Werner Klemperer as well. So some people who became there he is, a lot more famous on television, William Shatner and Klemperer. Interesting. The credits on IMDb said that Victor Bono is in this movie as one of the courtroom spectators. I have to tell you, I didn't find him, but if you remember that name, he also became well known partly for playing one of the bad guys on the Batman TV series. Played a character named King Tut. There's Werner Klemperer. So we've talked often about the Jewish actors and actresses in some of these movies. There are few in this movie, but it's interesting to note that one of them is, Werner Klemperer's father was Jewish. Right? He actually converted to Christianity and then came back to Judaism later in life. So it's interesting to think about that. We saw John Banner last week, Sergeant Schultz, and of course, Werner Klemperer is also known for Hogan's Heroes for being Colonel Klink, and the two of them were playing Nazis in that show, as Werner Klemperer is here as well. The only one of these guys who's completely unrepentant in a sense, and interesting to note that those are the actors who are Jews in these movies. Some of them were refugees from Nazi Europe, like Marlena Dietrich, who started out her career in Europe, but came to America as a refugee. That may not be quite the right word, when you're already a famous actress and you come to Hollywood to start working. but leaving Nazi Europe to get away from it. Um, I heard, I think Vanessa mentioned Madeline Kahn playing her in Blazing Saddles, and that's absolutely, you can even see in some of these pictures the character um, that Madeline Kahn really based it on. So it's not specifically this movie, it's Marlena Dietrich in general. And she was a very good actress who lived from 1901 to 1992. She had one Oscar nomination. It was for a movie called Morocco, but she's very good in a lot of movies, including one directed by Orson Welles called Touch of Evil from 1956, which is a terrific movie, and she's quite good in that. So during the war or during the Nazi regime, she was in America and she teamed up with Billy Wilder, who was a Jewish director who also left Germany in the 1930s to escape the Nazis. And together they created a fund to rescue European Jews. And so Marlena Dietrich and Billy Wilder were responsible for doing a lot of good during this time and doing their best to get as many refugees out after them as they could. Mention a few of the other folks in one way or another in here. I mean, Richard Windmark, who to my mind is maybe the one person in the movie who kind of overplays. He's pretty over the top for a lot of the movie. He lived from 1914 to 2008. His first movie, he got an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actress, a pretty dark film noir where he pushes someone down the steps in a wheelchair. It's called Kiss of Death in 1947. Interestingly enough, well, there it is. Right, that's the picture they put on his obituary, apparently, is him gleefully pushing a woman down the steps. So so he got an Oscar nomination for that. Interestingly enough, for where we are, he studied at Lake Forest College and graduated in 1936. So just a little up the road a piece. So, and another sort of odd piece of Jewish trivia, that his daughter was married to Sandy Koufax for about 15 years, I think, in the 1970s and 80s. So just a little odd. So, Bert Lancaster, of course, was nominated for 4 Oscars in his career. He lived from 1913 to 1994. He won one of those Oscars, was for Elmer Gantry in the early 60s, if memory serves. He was an outspoken liberal throughout his life. If I may say this here, Ed Asner speaks glowingly of Bert Lancaster, and he says, he taught us how to be a liberal with balls, which is an interesting quote, which I'm sure Bert Lancaster was proud to have someone say that about him. Spencer Tracy, of course, lived from 1900 to 1967. He was born up the road a piece in Milwaukee. And in his career, I think he had 9 Oscar nominations, which is a pretty extraordinary number. He won just one. It was for Boys Town. So Judy Garland, these are people who don't really need much in the way of introduction to you. She was nominated for Best Supporting Actress in this, and also for A Star is Born in 1954. The only Oscar she won was actually in 1940. She was given a special Oscar in 1940, a Juvenile Award. So that's the year after The Wizard of Oz. But of course, she'd made a whole series of movies, the movies with Mickey Rooney, let's put on a show movies, right? So she was given a special Oscar as a juvenile actress in 1940. So, let's see, who have I left out? Well, of course, Montgomery Clift, who we talked about quite a bit last week. I think, you know, and so here he is again, 1961. So this is 3 years approximately after the filming of The Young Lions. So it's still after his, you know, after his accident, the rebuilding of his face and so forth. Again, on Turner Classic Movies, if you want to see Montgomery Clift before the accident, I noticed that they're running a couple of his early movies over the next week or two. So so you can take a look for that. So some of his early work. So, but his performance here, where he plays potentially a developmentally disabled man who was sterilized against his will by the Nazi regime, it really is, I would say, a brilliant performance, extraordinary, difficult to watch in many ways. I mean, it's so good. Now, reading up on this, you find some things about, you know, Montgomery Clift, as we talked about last week, after his accident, was in constant pain and was unquestionably addicted to painkillers at this point in his life. And according to the stories, was actually really unable to memorize lines. And Stanley Kramer, the director, apparently said to him, "You know what the story is, just answer the questions the attorney asks you," right? And this is, in a way, sort of classic method acting. I mean, Montgomery Clift inhabited this character so completely that he didn't need a script. You know, the attorneys would ask him questions and he responded as the character, right? And so it's not clear to me, and maybe not to anybody, how much of what he says from the stand was actually written by the author of the screenplay. But it's unquestionably true that he creates an indelible image in this movie that, you know, it's one of the things that, you know, when I first saw the movie, it's one of those scenes that you don't forget, and seeing it again, you know, it's incredibly powerful. So
I think that that both Judy Garland and Montgomery Clift were better than the ones in the Playhouse, and just riveting performances. And I had watched the television first, so I knew what was happening, but I thought their performances were unbelievable.
Yeah, they're both extraordinary. They both deserve those Oscar nominations and probably deserve those Oscars. But Montgomery Clift in particular, I mean, it's such an interesting story, and that it's so unclear whether he was delivering lines or not. And it's an amazing performance, I think. So, so I just mentioned the music, the composer, not nominated for this movie, but his name is Ernst Gold, or Ernest Gold, I guess. His original name was Ernst Sigmund Goldner. We mentioned him a while back because he wrote the theme for Exodus the year before this one. So, and so he was nominated for Oscars for Exodus and for a couple of other movies that Stanley Kramer made. On the Beach, It's a Mad, Mad World, and The Secret of Santa Vittoria. He actually, I think, maybe scored all of Stanley Kramer's movies. So, and many other things as well. But so, so I just wanted to bring him to your attention since he wrote the theme for Exodus as well. So, let's see. So, and that theme takes us to the beginning of the movie. I mean, we talked about credit sequences before, and we have one here as well. I mean, if you notice that it begins with these kind of martial drums in the background. The names of the primary actors and actresses are superimposed on a screen that seems to have bits and pieces of the swastika, right? It doesn't show the swastika in whole during that time when their names come up. That doesn't come up until we see the site of the infamous Nuremberg rallies, and the music changes, and there's a kind of a vocal score at that point. And we see our, and then so that credit sequence essentially ends with archival footage of the detonation of the giant swastika on top of that stadium built for those Nazi rallies in Nuremberg. So at which point we see the we see the Jeep ride, I guess, riding through Nuremberg as Spencer Tracy arrives, and along with a senator, and is being taken to the place where he'll stay to be the chief judge of the upcoming Nuremberg tribunal, right? And so what we see is rear projected scenes, right? So this is still done in movies to this day. I would say that the technique has probably been refined some since 1961, but it's an interesting way for the filmmaker to be able to use film footage of Nuremberg from right after the war. I mean, completely destroyed, you know, bombed out buildings and all those things. By 1961, I mean, there was substantial rebuilding across Europe, you know, when the movie was made. But by using this rear projection technique, the director is able to show the state of what Nuremberg must have looked like during the time of those Nuremberg trials. So, and the movie will make ample use of archival footage through that process of you know, of rear projecting whenever somebody's in a car in this movie. So it's well done, I think, and certainly well done for its time. And of course, this scene brings the judge and the senator to the mansion where he will be staying while he's the judge, right? And introduces a few of the other characters, his driver, Schmidt, Mr. and Mrs. Halberstadt, who take care of the home and took care of it for the former, they were staff for the former owners as well. The senator who appears again later in the movie, Senator Burkett, and Captain Byers, played by William Shatner, who is his liaison to help with a lot of the different things. So, these scenes kind of set the stage, and then we get to the Hall of Justice the next day, and we meet the judges who are on trial, and the attorneys. Again, I think the movie does the the defense attorney starts out speaking in German, right? And everyone's listening on the headphones to get the translation. The camera sort of pans up over the translator, and Maximilian Schell begins to speak in English, right? And so the movie sets for us this idea that, and throughout the movie, people continue to put the headphones on and off when they should be hearing a translation, right? Even though we're hearing English. So I think it's, again, a clever way to make that work in movie, you know, not wanting to have an entire movie of subtitles, you know, constant back and forth between the German and the English. That's the way they choose to do it. Sorry about the dog. Someone's at the door. So, so I'm not sure there's anyone to answer that door. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to go see what that is. Excuse me just a minute.
So let's just pin me. Well,
Sorry about that. I'm
oh,
back.
he's back. Okay.
Yeah.
I was ready to give, so many.
Excuse me.
Love you.
Thank you. It's actually Seal Ann's birthday today, and deliveries are showing up at the door as a result. So anyhow, so let's see. We were, entering the courtroom, right, and introducing the characters, and the main judge that's on trial, Ernst Janning. And the argument being made that the judge does not make the law; he carries them out, and so there's this question of culpability, and in a sense, that's what the whole movie is about, right? And I'd say it's pretty remarkable, and it's fairly remarkable for its time. In the late 50s, when the television version came out, in the early 60s, when to have the defense attorney stand up and talk about the industrialists in America who made money selling arms to Germany prior to the war, to Winston Churchill's praise of Hitler before the war starts, right? All these things to sort of, you could call it shifting blame, but you could also argue that he's making a pretty cogent argument for the culpability of the world for what goes on in Nazi Europe, right? And so if these judges are guilty, then everybody else is guilty as well, right?
The thing that I thought was remarkable because of the time that it came out is that they showed those films. And we, over the years, have seen, terrible films from the Shoah, and, different films have used those. But I think then I can't imagine that most people had seen that.
Right. Yeah. And so, this is another example of how Stanley Kramer earns his title as the conscience of the American film industry, right? Is by, people might have seen those in more academic settings, maybe in Jewish fundraising settings, actually, but to put them into a film with an all-star cast was to show them to people who might never have seen them. Now, some of this stuff might have been in newsreels and things like that, but it just, has a way of permeating the culture through this movie that got there in a way that it wouldn't have in others. And this is pretty early to talk about for this kind of thing. So, but as you may know, the Allies, when they came in and liberated these camps, they had orders to document what they saw there. And we see this if you visit the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., you see the quote from Dwight Eisenhower. It's one of the first things you see is essentially an order to take note, to archive what they see when they come into these camps, so that no one will be able to deny it in future generations. Right? So
Rabbi Brenda has a comment or a question.
Sure.
Well, in the same vein, the other thing that the Spencer Tracy, the chief judge for the prosecution, he made the point that it was nobody really wanted to prosecute. He said, I wasn't the first choice. I was maybe the 20th or whatever number it was he gave.
Yeah, so not even the 10th choice.
Yeah. So, it was not a popular stand. I think people wanted to forget about the Holocaust.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we talked about this a little bit last week about um, the tendency in Hollywood movies to make there was no sort of I can't think of a movie that makes the Japanese look kind of okay, you know. But we watched the Young Lions, and we see the argument that Marlon Brando didn't know anything about death camps until he runs into one. And we hear that from Marlena Dietrich too, about her husband, you know, a general who didn't know anything about that stuff, right? And I think on one level, Hollywood is propagating that, and I think that you know, I'm not willing to go there, frankly. I think that's highly unlikely that that people of such high ranks knew nothing, and certainly the you know, the townspeople. It's a very complicated issue. It's not simple. You know, having visited Poland shortly before the pandemic and quarantine, and that was my first visit to Eastern Europe, because frankly, when I was a younger man, I didn't think I could stomach it. But now with more and more time passing, and as I've gotten older, maybe I was able to do it. But the complicated relationship between Polish anti-Semitism and the Nazis, you know, it is complicated, right? But the idea that nobody knew that Auschwitz was going on is hard to believe. And especially so because we knew that the American State Department knew about it, right? And so when we talk about, you know, who's responsible, you know, the people who pull the trigger, the people who run the gas chamber, I mean, they're responsible. But the fact that, you know, if you remember, the book was published maybe the 1970s, I think, while 6 million died, you know, about what happened in the Western world, what happened in America in terms of not opening up quotas for immigration in the 1930s and into the 40s, that you know, there is culpability to go around in these situations. But the idea of exonerating Germans is there's a bit of a Hollywood aspect to that, I think, and you know, and so Hollywood wanted to forget about these things. America certainly didn't treat Germans in America the way they treated Japanese and other Asian people in America. So,
Rabbi, with regard to West Side Story, wasn't that story originally supposed to be the Jews versus the, you know, the other rather than the Puerto Ricans, and then they changed it? Could, you know?
I don't know about that.
I've heard that.
Sounds plausible.
Yeah,
you know.
I've heard that, you know, they said if you use, it's too Jewish. And
Yeah.
I think that happened in Hollywood a lot too.
Yeah.
I see Susan's got her hand up.
Oh.
too.
Yeah, Rabbi, in talking about what the Germans knew and what they didn't, for any of us who have visited concentration camps in Germany, and I've been to 3 of them,
Yeah.
it's impossible that the people did not know
Yeah.
what was going on. When you see where those camps were located, and there were neighborhoods close by,
Yeah.
and it's impossible that the
Right.
people did not know what was going on and what was happening. I mean, it's just an excuse.
Right.
It's interesting. I think I've told you before, my husband did a lot of business in Germany. And when we were there in 1989, right after the Berlin Wall came down, and we went to Dresden, and it was still rubble in Dresden at that time. It was like the war had just ended.
What year did you say?
1989.
Wow.
And it was like Eastern Germany had not been rebuilt
Yeah.
the way the West had.
Yeah.
And then it was interesting. We were out to dinner with some business people that he had to do business with. And somebody asked me if I had any relatives in Germany.
Uh-huh.
I couldn't believe that question.
Right.
It was like, does this man not know that I'm Jewish?
Yeah. Well,
I had to be polite because what I wanted to say was, thank God, no, because if I had, you would have killed them all.
right.
Um,
I mean, it-
yeah.
it- they
Yeah,
were-
I'm with you 100% in terms of,
Yeah.
I believe that people knew, when I say that it's complicated, what I mean is that, the complicity of the Poles in Poland is complicated. The lack of action on the part of the American State Department, is complicated, right? All of those things interconnect into a terrible storm of death and destruction, So there's
we
other
have-
bands. I mean,
Yeah,
John.
we have Ed, Shoshana, and then Meredith.
I had John before that,
Oh,
actually.
okay. All right, John, you go. Then Ed, Shoshana, Meredith.
Great.
Thank you, Rabbi. Gail and I saw this movie a little over 15 years ago on a river cruise ship
Well,
on a Friday night. I had a little difficulty staying awake because I didn't realize it was such a long movie after a day of sightseeing. But on Saturday, we were in Nuremberg and we toured the parade grounds. And then we sat in that courtroom because on Saturday, it was an active courtroom, except on Saturday, they did not have proceedings. So we sat in the courtroom and they had a docent, a lady who explained everything first in German, because there were German visitors there also, townspeople, and then in English, and described the whole thing and where the prisoners were kept so that they didn't have to go outside to go to the courtroom for fear that somebody would assassinate them on the way. That was all. But it was fascinating that we were actually sitting in the same as Spencer Tracy the night before was describing it.
Yeah, very interesting, right? And those cases went on for several years after the war, and that's the movie's last sort of indictment of the whole thing is that the movie comes out in 1961. It says 99 people were sentenced in these Nuremberg trials, and none of them were in prison as of 1961. Every one of them had their life sentence. Those who had life sentences were vacated, and and even in the movie itself, it talks about how in the case of industrialists like I.G. Farben, who used slave labor through the war, that they got off with a slap on the wrist, right? And so we have that right within the movie as well. And of course, we know that America was more than happy to rehabilitate some of those scientists like Werner von Braun to come to America and work on the weapons for America and the space race, right? So again, the argument that Maximilian Schell's character makes about complicity of others than the people who are actually being put on trial, that they're all the sacrificial lambs for the rest of society, is worth hearing, and certainly means something. So who was next?
Ed, and then Shoshana, then Meredith.
As a echoing of what Sue Wellick said, Judy and I were in Theresienstadt, and yet there's another country, and all around the camp, there's this lovely little village with houses, apartments, and a countryside within a block or so of the camp. You talk about complicity and not knowing. Of course they had to know. They knew exactly what was going on.
Shoshana, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. There are two movies with the same name, Judgment at Nuremberg. One is an hour and a half, shown on Amazon
Yeah,
Prime.
Shoshana, we talked about that at the beginning. So the hour and 15 minutes was a play on television, and then the movie is 3 hours. And hopefully, if you either saw both, or you could go back and catch the one that you haven't seen.
Okay.
But they
The
are
only-
both by
okay.
the same author.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah, it seems like because the script was exactly the same. And
Right.
although the short movie, of course, is much shorter, I thought it was pretty effective. One thing he does a little bit better was showing that after the Russian became the main menace, how nobody has had patience to continue with the trials.
Right.
I thought they did a little bit better emphasis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Meredith and then Maxine.
I was just going to comment that I believe that West Side Story was originally conceived as being East Side Story and was supposed to be between Jews and Catholics in Lower East Side of Manhattan.
Good information. I never heard that before.
Yeah.
And Maxine, you need to unmute.
I think where the concentration camps, where the gas chambers were, there's no way that the people in the area didn't know what was happening because there were odors and there was smoke. But I think in Theresienstadt, that was not, if they killed anybody, they hung them. There were no ovens there. And another thing I wanted to comment on, the Franks and we went to, we were in Dresden in about 2012 or so, and it had been rebuilt and was rebuilt, you know, classically. It was very charming. So that's all I had to say.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. And these camps do differ from each other and those kinds of things. The movie actually makes it very clear, right? There's a scene where the judges are, I guess, having lunch in the penitentiary where they're being held. So one of them can turn around and talk to a guy who was a concentration camp commandant, who explains to him that the killing of millions of people is easy. The disposing of the bodies is what's hard, right? A very sort of practical explanation, in a sense, that's just, I mean, it's just so horrifying, when you hear it. But the movie does such a powerful job of including those kinds of details to help help the reality of this sink in, you can gas people thousands at a time, but you have to put them into ovens one by one. It's awful.
Yeah.
I see Alice's hand. Was
Yes.
there something else?
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment. I know, Rabbi, last week you mentioned about the playing of the German music in the Young Lions, before the war, and how, it kind of represented the German culture and nationalism. And
Right.
I saw the same thing in Judgment at Nuremberg, obviously after the war. But I think it was interesting, it was when Spencer Tracy and Marlena Dietrich are at dinner, I think, right? That the
Yeah.
music playing. And I just thought it was interesting because it was kind of like, well, they went through this whole war, but a lot of the Germans obviously weren't ready to, denounce, get away from that German nationalistic kind of point of view.
Right. There's a place, I think it's Marlena Dietrich's character talks about how Germans like to go out to bars and sing together, right? And then we see that scene of them later on, and the drinking songs going on, the beer steins are going up and down.
Mhm.
And,
It was kind of menacing to me.
yeah, this is what I thought when I was visiting Eastern Europe not that long ago, that I can't imagine what it's like to be able to go to these places and just find stuff like that charming, you know, I just don't know. I mean, I can't put myself in that place that people go to, you know, to visit, you know, Prague and you know, parts of Poland and places like that. And they just go there as tourists and they have beer and they, you know, eat food, and, you know, and not have kind of this reaction to it. And of course, the, you know, the people that you see there are now, you know, we're talking about a couple of generations later. We're not talking about, right, if you went there in 1948, I mean, some of the times that some of you folks are talking about going, you know, where the people that you ran into were consciously alive during the Shoah, you know, even harder, I'm sure. But I just had this strange sense of, you know, I can't go to Poland without visiting Auschwitz and Theresienstadt, right? But other people do. They go there, and that's not on their tour agenda, right? And you know, they're there to go to a nightclub and to drink beer and those kinds of things. So I can't even imagine what it's like to actually have that experience of it, and not the experience that you're describing, Alice, which is this kind of sense of menace when people sing together in, you know, in Eastern Europe, right? So I guess maybe on some level I'd like to be able to experience it that way, but I can't.
Rabbi?
Yes.
My parents were survivors from Germany, so the German mayor from the town that they lived, they use the word Wiedergutmachen. They want to like give retribution for what they've done wrong. So they invite a group of people from Germany, from Israel, you know, people that had originally lived there, and they do a little, you know, they get together. It's the mayor, it's members of the local government and clergy. And it's kind of an educational thing. We went to visit the kids in school, and they took us to the Jewish synagogue and the cemetery and all the, so I mean, I guess in you know, I guess in, this was in the 1990s. I guess in some ways they're trying to make good on what they've done.
Yeah, well, there's no question that Germany itself has worked on this issue to some degree. And we're seeing some backsliding, as we are seeing in a lot of Eastern Europe right now. But you know, they for years paid reparations, maybe still pay reparations that go directly to the state of Israel, that go to Holocaust survivors. I'm, you know, going to Israel for the first time in 1972 with my parents. My father seeing that the buses were all made by Mercedes, you know, was a shock to him, right? You know, but this was part of the reparations money. Most of the rail system that was built in Israel after 1949 was paid for by the German government in reparations. So, so there's no question about that.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I was in Berlin 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's incredible what they have done to acknowledge the crimes of the Nazis, because everywhere you go in Berlin are monuments and brass plaques with the names of victims, and they everywhere. They will not let anybody forget.
Right.
And for that, I felt I had to admire that at least they were owning up to it and hopefully trying to make, I mean, you can't ever make it right because it was so wrong. It was so horrible. But to acknowledge it and have it memorialized in a city like Berlin,
right,
I think is something positive.
Yes.
What I wanted to say is in light of what's happening in our country today, I wish that all these QAnon people and everybody should be forced to watch this movie.
Yeah, I'm not sure that would help, but you know, but it is. I think the movie itself stands for itself as a remarkable document. There's a scene after those scenes are after those films, those archival films are shown in the trial where the Maximilian Schell character, I mean, he starts by saying, these were shocking films, devastating. I'm ashamed such things took place in my country. There can never be a justification for them, not in generations, not in centuries. It's a well-written speech. We shouldn't forget that the writer of that speech is a Jewish screenwriter, you know, putting these words into that man's mouth. But it's a scene like that certainly makes the performance by Maximilian Schell worthy of an Oscar, because he goes from there to saying, but I do think it was indecent, unfair of the prosecution to show these films at this time in this court against these defendants, right? Which is the point that he'll make throughout the movie. It's you know, some are responsible, all are implicated, right? So
John has his hand up. I'm also going to put in the chat. Next week is Frisco Kid. We're going to a more
definite change of pace.
Definite change of pace. It's one of my favorites. And John, go ahead.
Well, I have a question, and I don't know. I saw both of them yesterday, the Playhouse 90 and the movie, and I enjoyed both of them for different reasons. But because the dialogue, and especially the court scenes, was identical, I wonder if those actually came from the court records, or if because the same screenwriter wrote both of them, that he wrote all of that dialogue. But it appeared to me that it might be actual dialogue from the court transcripts.
Right. So nothing in the production notes tell me that it was. But I do see a note that Abbey Mann read the transcript of the judge's trial, and so he was familiar with the transcript. Whether he actually used the dialogue verbatim in any way, I mean, nothing seems to suggest that. His nomination was for Best Original Screenplay, so I'm not sure whether it would have been adapted if people felt that it was enough borrowed from some other kind of published document. So, but I don't actually know any more than that. But he certainly read it. So there's no question that he read those transcripts. And so he may well have used some exact language. He may have wrote his own embellished version. Okay. Courtroom scenes, are never, courtroom scenes in movies are generally more dramatized than courtrooms. Right? So I doubt that much of it is verbatim, but here and there, similar to the way Aaron Sorkin used in the movie that's nominated for Best Picture and Best Screenplay this year, he used the actual records of the trials of the Chicago 7, but he embellished them and changed things around and made things more scenic, right, for movies.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Especially thank you, Rabbi. Also, besides next week's movie, Jim Kenny will be here on Sunday, and we have a Locks Box. And look at your My Macomb, and the link is right in there. And we need more people to sign up. We think you don't know about it. Oh, and tomorrow is Jim Schuster's doing a fabulous class on the Holocaust Debt too, all in your Macomb at home. If you have any questions, you know where to get a hold of me. I also have short stories tomorrow morning. We keep you busy, every day for most of the day. All right, I have to go to my next Zoom.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see you.
Everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.